Hello, and welcome to the Collective Impact webinar series. I'm Amelia Pismay, the USBC Deputy Director, and I'm so glad to have you join us for this session. This is a bi-monthly series that was launched as part of our efforts to engage stakeholders in a collective impact model. This is part of the USBC Strategic Framework Goal number 3. With funding support from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, this series will focus on building the capacity of the breastfeeding field to apply collective impact principles and tools to collaborative efforts for policy and practice change. Webinars are held every 2 months in the even-numbered months on the 4th Tuesday of the month from 2 o'clock to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The recording, along with any handouts or slides, will be posted on the new Collective Impact Learning community and on the public webpage that's listed here for you. A few logistics. During today's sessions, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. However, we'd love to hear your insights, questions, and comments, so you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. Here's how you do it. Go to the control panel on the right of your screen, and if you don't see it, it may be minimized. Click on the orange tab, and it will pop back out. If you scroll down below the audio section, you will see a tab for questions. When you click on it, it will open up a box for you to type in. If you have any technical issues during today's session, please send an email to office@breastfeeding.org, and our staff should be able to assist you. And that brings me to today's topic, community engagement, setting the stage for dialogue. Community engagement is an ongoing and iterative process, particularly in collective impact initiatives. Now that you have started to identify who needs to be at your table with the top 100 partners exercise covered in the last session, this session will discuss how to bring everyone together. Join us to explore approaches and methodologies for convening an in-person meeting. Our speaker today is going to cover how to invite stakeholders to the table, framing a mutually beneficial call to action, setting the stage for building relationships in person, hosting a collective conversation. Setting the stage for conversation is an opportunity to serve your objectives, strengthen your relationships with key stakeholders, and ensure ongoing support for a more sustainable initiative. I'm delighted to introduce our presenter for this session, Rachel Gaynor, Director of Engagement at Tamarack Institute. She combines emerging technologies, generative learning, and a results-driven approach to deepen engagement for Tamarack's nearly 20,000 learners. From 2008 to 2015, she championed the voice of the customer in the private sector at a leading high-tech company, where she developed a team of community analysts and project managers in the creation and delivery of a strategic collaborative approach to understand the needs of the community, used qualitative and quantitative data analysis to influence stakeholders to effect change, and measured impact through client-centric key performance indicators. Rachel's career began in journalism, working within her own community as a writer for local newspapers, where she developed her curiosity, care, and passion for listening and telling stories in a way that could make a positive impact. From 2006 to 2008, she focused on communications in Tamarack's Learning Center, helping to launch the inaugural Communities Collaborating Institute, establish Tamarack's first online learning communities, and published Community Conversations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's get started. So thank you so much for having me. Community engagement, as you heard from my bio, is near and dear to my heart in so many ways, in-person and online technologies for sure. So I'm looking forward to helping to set the stage for dialogue in your own coalitions and connect that back to the learning that you've already done related to collective impact and the overview that you may have received already, and as well as the top 100 exercise that you may have participated in the last session. There's certainly not requirements for setting the dialogue per se, but definitely they all fit together and help to make a stronger collective impact initiative move forward. So as mentioned, I'm the Director of Engagement for Tamarack Institute. I lead a team across Canada here, but we do engage quite regularly across the US, and so really love to connect with you virtually. What a theme that you will hear as we go through the content of today's session is the notion of trust. And Stephen Covey, a notable author, I'm sure many have heard of him, I love this quote. It says, "Collaboration builds at the speed of trust." So as you're setting the stage for dialogue, as you may be embarking on your own collaborative efforts, whether it falls within the collective impact model or not, to really build collaboration, to set that stage, you need to ensure that a focus of trust is present throughout, and that with each stage you're being open, honest, and acting in a way that is going to build and maintain trust. So that'll be, you'll hear more about that transparency, visibility, and openness and how it builds into each aspect, but that's something you want to consider at all stages. So as mentioned, so in the previous webinar, you looked at identifying potential top 100 partners. And so this is where you consider the top people in an organization that would help realize the change you want to see. Formally or informally, this involves brainstorming your list, ranking your list in various ways by speaker, by person or organization or location or sector, perhaps. And then you want to consider who to approach first. So as part of that exercise, and you look to reach out to potential partners, one of the things that I would caution and the lens that I would advise you to look at is recognizing that you want to be setting the dialogue sort of in two lenses. So you've got your usual suspects. Those are the people you know, the people who know you, and there may be some trust already established. This is a really comfortable place to set the stage for dialogue, sort of like having a conversation with your friends already. And that's a great place to start. But recall that according to the conditions of collective impact and keeping in mind that equity lens, you also want to be thinking about setting the stage for dialogue with unusual suspects or strangers. And you can see the quote on the screen, "Strangers are friends you really haven't met yet." So these unusual suspects or strangers are people from sectors who you may not have engaged with before, so either at all or with any success. So trust may not be established, or it may have been broken and needs to be rebuilt. But those are sort of two lenses, so your usual suspects and your unusual suspects. And to fit truly within a representative model of collective impact, I highly encourage you to establish partners that have lived experience. So in terms of establishing that trust and reaching out, collective impact, if you recall from the 5 conditions, one of the key conditions there, the 4th one along the list, is continuous communication. So as much as setting the stage for dialogue is important, so too is keeping the stage open, active, and responsive. So it's one thing to craft an ask and an invite to connect with someone, but making sure that you're planning for and set the expectations about keeping that communication open is key. And continuous communication, it really helps to build trust, as I spoke to before, reach an agreement on common goals you might be seeking to accomplish together, and to create motivation and momentum. And a piece that I'll say about momentum in particular is that communication is actually one of the keys to building that momentum. When communication dies out, that's often when we see momentum die down. And so momentum is key to help driving collective impact, especially because it takes a long-term commitment to achieve results. So setting the stage for a dialogue is typically seen within or even before stage one or phase one, whatever you'd like to call it, of a collective impact initiative. So when you're setting the team, this is really about identifying your key partners and then bringing them to the table to start those conversations. Now, with that said, we know collective impact is very iterative. Success looks different in many ways. There is no playbook. So setting the stage for dialogue is something you may see in phase 2, 3, 4, and so on, as you may need to reinvigorate your partner list and bring new collaborative partners to the table. All of these keys and tools and terms that you'll use today can be used throughout. But really where we are today is looking at being prepared and starting early on in your collective impact initiative. So speaking of being prepared, one of the ways that for anything to be successful is to do a bit of your research. And so what that looks like is to consult with others around you. That may look like peer support, but it's not seeking support for your initiative. It's really just consulting those around you to ensure that your messages are clear, that your goals are clear, and that you're engaging with the right people. Sort of a checks and balances for your own self. That may look like assembling a working group, but we'll talk about that in a moment. You want to know yourself in the process, and we'll definitely dig into that and explore accessible language and how you use language to define what it is you're trying to do. You want to know your audience, and that's where some research comes in for sure. Identify some mutually beneficial opportunities. So this is something that you can establish beforehand, but also as you're collaborating with potential partners, you can work through that. But you definitely want to come to the table prepared, thinking through what it is and why you should be collaborating. And then setting the stage. And setting the stage, we'll go through these in more detail today, but that looks like crafting your call to actions. Your benefits should be mutual when you're setting the stage, and seeking to learn. And so that seeking to learn really goes back to the concept of trust. When you're seeking to learn and really to actively listen, that's a big role in creating and developing trust within your network and across your partners. This goes for not just a collective impact initiative, it goes for any relationship building, really, as I'm sure you know, that it's not about a one-sided conversation. You want to hear what other people have to say, what their ideas are, set a stage where that's made possible and can be continued throughout your dialogue. So do your homework. Some of this may be formal. It doesn't require, funds, a lot of time, necessarily a lot of resources. Where you are looking to engage with larger audiences, I do recommend considering a more structured approach to engagement rather than a quick email or a phone call. And after all, regardless whether your audience is 1, 2, or 200, just recall a collective impact approach to collaboration requires commitment. So be prepared to do planning, especially at this stage, to plan out some of the elements of kickstarting your dialogue. So let's first dive into consulting others or assembling a working group. So what this might look, but this is how this might look. So if you're seeking to engage a group of partners or set out in a more systematic and strategic way, that's where I would consider forming a working group. And it could be, there's no magic number to your working group. My advice there is really a working group is a group of people that represents several kinds of people who are championing your work. It's not so much about the partners, it's about some of the peers that can help you develop the mission statement, some early goal planning, and bring some structure and definition to what it is you're trying to accomplish from your end in seeking partnership. I've done examples where a working group may have 6 people. There's been working groups of 10 people, but I've also sometimes just consulted with 1 or 2 people off the side of my desk to ensure that I'm not missing anything. This could include staff members, board members, volunteers, or other people within a similar network. The goal of consulting or working through a group is really to help steer through your engagement process and consider who else could be at the table. And again, the size, it's not so much about size, it's more about just making sure that you have some checks and balances in your preparation. Having others at the table to set your stage for dialogue multiplies your reach and your network. So as a single person, I may have a particular Rolodex of people I can reach out to, but once you start to bring in others, even in your own network, so your staff, board members, or volunteers, this helps to multiply your reach and expand reach into other networks. Those you consult with, or whether you're assembling a working group, can also assist with research and that prep. So researching who some potential partners can be, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that research looks like. They could assist with crafting invitations and bringing some skills where you might not have them, and this is similar to the model of collective impact as a whole, where you want to increase your capacity. So you can increase your capacity right at the beginning within your own direct networks before you set the stage. They can assist with crafting your call to action and then bringing your own credibility. So depending on, we all know that sometimes hierarchies and authority plays a strong role. It's always nice to maybe have the president of your organization or a key member of your community there with you when you're crafting your call to action and putting it out there to help build your own credibility. This could be a contextual source to help build credibility. Could be formal, informal. That's up to you. But it's someone who's helping to craft your call to action and step forward in a strategic way. So in that, as you're doing that consulting amongst yourself to really understand how it is you want to set the dialogue, let's talk a bit about assessing yourself. And so there's 2 pieces to this. There's knowing yourself and knowing your audience when setting the stage. I want to dig into knowing yourself because in my early days of communications, I mentioned early on in my bio, my background is in journalism. I spent a lot of time understanding my audience and understanding the community around me so that I can tell their story. And that's a great skill to have in journalism. When you are seeking to partner in a collective impact initiative, knowing yourself, I would say, is equally, if not more, important in these early stages of setting the dialogue than I can speak to. So I want to dive into that. So knowing yourself, here's some guidelines around there. So take some inventory of what it is that you want to accomplish. What is the mission you're seeking to set out on? What is your plan? What is the language that you're going to use to set that stage? And what is it that you are doing or not doing that helps or hinders the development of the partnership you're seeking to establish? This is a time to take stock, maybe identify some successes you wish to share, to craft your message, and to understand why you're reaching out to a particular partner. Are you seeking to build capacity? If so, how? Ultimately, how could your goals be seen as mutually beneficial? This is all part of knowing yourself. Another very colloquial way of saying this, it's the elevator pitch. I sort of laugh when I'm talking to my family and friends who are outside of the nonprofit sphere. They ask me what is it that I do. I have a 9-year-old and a 2-year-old daughter, and I definitely know that when my daughter goes to school, she has no idea how to explain what I do. And I'm sure there are ways in which this applies to the work that you do as well. So ultimately, what I'm talking about here is the importance of your elevator pitch and what is the language that you're using to communicate out to your audience. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. And that's where it goes to building your accessible language. So that elevator pitch, I mean, the real term there is your accessible language. It refers to the terms, the ideas, and the vocabulary you use to speak about the mission, the ways in which you work, your particular strengths and weaknesses, and the change you seek to make or the impact that you seek to make. And so the goal here is to really build a language that other people can understand. So ensuring that, you know, take the time and do the research to ensure that you have a vocabulary in which you can speak. And so what can be challenging here, though, is building your accessible languages for different audiences or different stages in by which you've engaged people. So if this is the first time you're engaging with someone, you've never met them, they fall into that stranger category, you're going to speak in a different way than you would to someone you've been working with for several years who is a colleague. So build your accessible language, by knowing your audience, knowing who they are, and what it is that they know about you. And so knowing your audience in this way, you may need to make some assumptions. But here are some categories that at least can provide a base for helping to consider different buckets of language within which to craft your accessible language. So your colleagues, for example, you're going to build an accessible language and you're going to use terms and vocabulary that they use every day in their language. Right? You probably share this vocabulary, those terms, the methodologies, the ideas, and there's an innate agreement in your communication that there's some shared understanding. So that's probably where you're most comfortable. And in some ways, you're not even using a language to describe what you're doing. You're just doing the work. And what you're doing is describing the work that needs to be done. That's the accessible language in that sphere. On the other side, and here's where we go back to your usual and unusual suspects. The strangers are your unusual suspects. And as you can see here, there's sort of ranges to the unusual suspects. If you're communicating with someone with lived experience, for example, how does that language change? Not only how does the language change, but how does your approach change? You certainly want to use language that builds trust, going back to the beginning of our session where that works through. You want to make sure that you're speaking in a respectful manner, you're using language that doesn't make assumptions, and you're using language that also breeds transparency and openness. Again, that accessible language is going to change when you go into surrounding sectors. So if you regularly partner with government or other nonprofits who are familiar with, say, funding models or governance structures for your coalitions or for organizations, then you're going to start to see maybe some vernacular and some vocabulary that is shared. So getting this right out of the gate is not something that's easy to do, but it's certainly worth spending some time before you set the stage or as you're planning to set the stage for dialogue to ensure you're knowing your audience, you have your quote-unquote elevator pitch ready and your terms and vocabulary ready, and that you understand and have a sort of a working knowledge of whether or not you think that's going to be accessible enough to your audience. There's some ways to research this, certainly, but if you're open to listening and you're building a trust, and you're conducting yourself in a way to build trustworthiness with your partners, then you'll likely see very quickly whether or not you're getting sort of the blank stares and the smiles and nods, or your audience is not understanding you, or whether or not the conversation and dialogue is picking up. So build an accessible language for multiple audiences, prepare that going in, and do some research to understand, to try and understand at least how your various audiences already perceive you and what they know about you. The other piece of advice I would give about the accessible language is going back to that first phase. The accessible language piece, just because we are going to go into an idea of a common language in a moment later on in this session today. But the idea of an accessible language is really about that setting the stage. So you're going in for the ask or the call to action, or you're trying to establish and build a partnership. That's where you want to make sure you have your accessible language. We are going to unfold the idea of a common language and how to build that with your partners in a moment. And that's something different. That's something that you experience when you're working alongside the partner. It's not something you develop in advance. So with that said, that's a good segue on to the further research that you want to do before you craft your invite to your partner, and that's the assessment of your audience. So I mentioned in my background with journalism, but it also carries in very heavily to the work that I'm doing today in engagement, is about knowing your audience. So you can see from the screen here and the sample questions about starting to unpack your audience and peel back that onion. They're very similar to understanding yourself and taking an internal inventory about your own work. The difference here is that you're going to have to be a little bit crafty in how you do this research. Again, when you do that consulting or developing a working group and you are sort of expanding your reach and your networks, you may have peers that know quite a bit about your audience. So that's a great resource to use to start to build understanding of your audience. Ask questions, get the conversation going as you consult your own networks, and build some understanding there. So use the human resource, if you will, that you have around you. Of course, there's the internet. You can always do that searching. But what's interesting about the internet and using websites and blogging and all that sort of stuff is back to that piece about the accessible language. So you may start running into language that you are finding that you're not familiar with. So breaking down those challenges can be difficult, and that's where sometimes just jumping into the invite and connecting with the partner can help you understand them better. But you do want to take the time to show that you've done your research to understand who your audience is. So take a look at what their mission. So a combination of a bit of peer research and using human resource and online research can go a long way. So understanding what is their mission, how are they already doing the work, who do they align with already. That can be a particular helpful piece of information about your audience to gather early on. Because when you're crafting your ask, if they're already collaborating with similar organizations or coalitions, then you're entering into that phase of competition, and you're going to need to start to understand why you and not them. What would you bring to the table, or better yet, how can you share your agenda and all work together? So understanding who else is at their table is a good piece of information to know about your audience when you're setting the stage for dialogue. And then looking at their strengths. There must be a strength, otherwise, potentially why would you want to partner with them? So what do they bring to the table? And then how could they be stronger, particularly by working collaboratively with you and other people or other sectors and other partners. This isn't necessarily something that you want to put together in a report and produce to the partner. This is for your own research, of course, just to ensure that you have done the background to get to know the other side. It's you can think of it sort of like a job interview. Before you go into your job interview, it's wise to do some research about the organization, about the position, and what you can bring to the table and how you might align to their mission. So do some assessment to know your audience, understand their mission, and who else is at the table so that you can fit yourself appropriately within it. So setting the stage for dialogue. So remember, conversation is a two-way street. Remember, this is an opportunity to align with your partners. Collective impact is not about advancing the agenda of your particular project or initiative. It's about a larger systems change. So when I say conversation is a two-way street, in some cases, depending on how many partners you're bringing to the table, it can be a multiple-way street. And so, you're going to have people coming in from all areas. And so it's not about your personal agenda, it's about moving the needle on a larger issue. So listen, and most importantly, seek to learn. So understanding understanding that you're seeking to form a collective and shared agenda around a larger issue for the both of you. The dialogue about strengths and challenges, about ideas and opportunities, priorities, and potential partnership, or the interest in potential partnership, should be a shared and common dialogue. Remember, as you're setting the stage for this dialogue, that you want to reinforce and identify ways that strengthening the relationship allows you to move the needle on a larger issue. So as you're crafting the ask, and we'll go into that in a moment, one of the ways to generate dialogue, one of the best ways to generate dialogue, is just simply to seek to learn. Ask questions. Ask about their strengths and challenges. So you've done your research already, and you want to definitely show that and showcase. But the research that you do on your own is never going to be as strong as it is once you start to reach out and connect and learn more through dialogue. So as you're seeking to generate dialogue, remember to seek to learn. And going back to that notion of trust and listening, seek to learn, and to learn, you need to listen. So ask about their strengths and challenges and explore that dialogue about the ideas and opportunities that are important to them, and how could you have a shared meaning and importance there. And then in that, you will be able to start to gauge interest in your partnership and leadership opportunities. But before we dive in deeper to that shared and common language and agenda, once the dialogue actually sets off, let's talk about some practical ways to craft your invite. So I can't stress enough to invite your partners personally. So in that assessment phase that we talked about, where you're consulting with your peers to pull together your own vision and your mission and doing some research, you should have done enough research to make a personal initial connection. Explain why you're reaching out and what you hope to accomplish in your invite. And I can't stress this enough, never ask people to commit on your first attempt. Your first attempt when you're setting the dialogue is about listening, and that's it. You'll want to set some parameters around the initial dialogue. So this doesn't need to be very cold and formal, but explaining a bit of a time commitment. If you're seeking to have sort of a one-to-one peer meeting, you know, just looking for an hour of your time or a 15-minute coffee, my treat, and set some clear expectations about your time. I just want to hear more about your initiative, potentially explore ways that we can work together, and have a mutual dialogue about some of the challenges we're facing in our work. And then remember, this is systems change, and you have the power to directly influence future ideas and programs and to enrich outcomes. So generate some excitement, right? There's a reason why you and your partner are in this work, and you can generate excitement from within that to craft your ask. Definitely want to track RSVPs. I mean, that's a bit of a tangible thing. And then, but most importantly, to thank people genuinely, and that's whether or not they agree to meeting. Take the time to always follow up and to be appreciative of the time that they're taking to respond back to you. Again, whether or not they're agreeing to meet. And then a courtesy would be to always confirm your meeting a day or two in advance, and then to share an agenda. One note of caution there about sharing the agenda, though, perhaps you might want to consider crafting that agenda together. So, you know, making an opportunity there for others to add in areas that they wish to speak to. As part of framing a mutually beneficial call to action, as part of framing and crafting your invite, you'll want to consider framing a mutually beneficial call to action. And depending on where you are from that top 100 exercise, so whether or not you're crafting this message towards your usual or unusual suspects, that's going to determine how easy this is. So all that being said, let's consider this. So these are sort of regardless of whether or not you're meeting with someone who you're very familiar with or who's familiar with you, or a stranger. First of all, explain why you're reaching out and what it is that you hope to accomplish. Think big picture systems change, not programmer specific. And also, you don't necessarily need to be too prescriptive. What you're hoping to accomplish may just be to meet and to listen and to learn more. But definitely do share that. Be open, be genuine, be appreciative, and think bigger picture. Going back to the research that we've done, that we've been speaking about, demonstrate that you've done your research. Highlight a win, a success, a challenge you've heard about, a collaborative opportunity that's been speaking about. What do you know about your partner, and why did they spark your interest? That's demonstrating that you've done your research. And are there obvious ways from your research that you've seen for aligning? Maybe you work through some of the same tools. Maybe the ways that you do your work are completely different, but you have a larger picture goal, or you've been challenged with a similar funding challenge or something like that. So where are there ways that you could align that, or that you can see some shared ground? Demonstrate you've done your research, and definitely mention that as you create and frame your mutually beneficial call to action. And then back to it, I will always say this: remember to seek to learn and to listen, listen, listen. And the exclamation point there is really about listening in a way that you're not preparing yourself to respond right away, but you're listening to learn. Goals of the conversation. At first, it's not about solidifying commitment and to creating next steps and actions necessarily, or to directly moving the needle. It's about getting people talking and sharing experiences. Co-generating learning between each other and capturing any insights, identifying any patterns. Sharing stories are the best way. I'm a storyteller by nature, so hearing each other's stories, and to create recommendations about how you can build and strengthen your relationship to address the change you're seeking to make. So that the goal of the conversation, to bring it back to the collective impact model, is around a shared and a common agenda from out the gates. So there's a few tools for creating a meaningful conversations and some great techniques. The techniques that I'm going to refer today are in a book called Community Conversations, Mobilizing the Ideas, Skills, and Passion of Community Organization, Governments, Businesses, and People. So again, it's just called Community Conversation, and it's by Paul Bourne. He is the president and lead coach at Tamarack Institute. There's a number of tools in there. I believe there are 10, but I picked out some of my favorite, and I've got a few examples here for group techniques, and then a couple examples for more one-to-one, peer-to-peer. So the first, these group conversations that I'll go over here there's 3 of them. Community conversations, and some of you may have actually been part of these. An example of a community conversation would be a community cafe. So it's 20 or more to 60 people. Less facilitation is required, and it's really an accessible way. A community conversation is about bringing, a number of people to the table, usually set up in round tables or circles of maybe 6 to 10 at most, and just having a series of questions and speaking points that you want people to connect on. Serious play, you can have less people, 10 to 50. It requires some experience with facilitation and requires more creative and abstract thinking, but it is a bit of a fun exercise to go through. And then there's visioning change. If you have an experienced facilitator or you are one, this is something to consider. It's really helpful if some momentum has already been built. So if you're connecting with stakeholders for the second or third time, or like I said, some momentum has been built or established. But also, if you are meeting at the table with people with like minds or usual suspects. The unusual suspects, if this is new, I would recommend going with something like a community conversation or a conversation cafe, where you can open up the dialogue a little easier. So these are 3 examples. I won't go into too much detail in them today, but they're great techniques to research for larger conversations. And there's a lot of examples and help out there that you can get with the types of questions and some tools you can use. Recently, I've been working with museums across the province of Ontario to facilitate discussions amongst museums, city councillors, community members on how they can increase engagement in local community museums. And so we've used conversation cafes as a great tool to bring people together, and it's a great way to bring some coffee and some treats to the table as well. Food always gets conversation going. So there's steps so another tool is capturing a common meeting or a common meaning. So I spoke earlier about creating an accessible vocabulary to set the stage for reaching out and crafting your invite. So once you've reached out, crafted your invite, and your partner has accepted, consider now creating and building a common vocabulary and identifying a common meaning. And so this is a shared meeting that you would have where you would employ this tool. And this tool, again, is still in the Community Conversations book that I mentioned. Just like I've been mentioning all the way, you'll definitely want to do some thinking in advance about the questions you might want to explore and consider together. And consider having someone facilitate the conversation for you. This allows you to step back, document your notes, like each of you can document your notes, and you can and share the stage, really. But really, a common meeting is just that. It's about considering number one, what questions you might have to explore together. And can help to build your common vocabulary. Two, so as I mentioned, consider having a common conversation facilitator. This is somebody third party to the both of you, and referring back to impact conditions. If you do have a backbone infrastructure in place, that's a great facilitator is a great tool to have as part of your backbone infrastructure. And we'll go into facilitation a little bit more in detail just now. A common meeting seeks to determine what you have in common, but it also seeks to identify your differences. So I just gave some examples of some common meaning questions that you can ask, but really it's a very basic structure to a conversation where you set up some questions in advance, a high level. So some examples here that I gave is, what does collaboration mean to me? Consider 3 ways we could support each other, and name 3 examples of positive impact. You'll want more questions than these, maybe 10 to 12 or 15. That and how you might move your needle forward in working together. Common meaning, it's a unique approach in which people can be deliberate about exploring words and concepts that they hold in common. It helps participants, both you and your partner, explore and talk about the meaning behind the words, and in doing so, you build a common understanding. And it's a great method to use when forming a collaborative. And so it's simple. You identify some questions, as I mentioned, in advance. You share them in advance of your conversation with your partner or potential partner, and then you simply ask the questions together. And so it's great to have this conversation over a cup of coffee or in person. You can do it in a group setting, as I mentioned, where you have a facilitator, but it's nice to have the conversation in person, have somebody taking some notes, and then you go back through the questions and you actually take inventory of your responses and see where you've used common language and where you haven't. And then the outcome then is understanding your common language, helping you to understand where you and your partner have common meaning across the different areas. So it's a nice way to build a shared and accessible language together, especially if this is an unusual suspect that you're engaging with, and it's not comfortable. You're not comfortable enough just diving in. And as I mentioned before, you definitely do not want to initiate a commitment or request right out the gate. And so this is a great way to ease the conversation, to develop a shared vocabulary, and to progress your dialogue along. Helpful tips around holding a peer-to-peer conversation. This could apply to a common meeting or a common meaning conversation, but just some guidelines to help a peer-to-peer conversation so that it unfolds in a comprehensive way. Step 1, unpack. So when you're starting your conversation, think of it just like unpacking a suitcase. Share your issue. Take the items out of your suitcase, if you will. Share your issue, share your story, and ask your potential partner to do the same. Question. As you're unpacking your stories, ask precise, clarifying questions to gain a better understanding and to get more details, and then go on to deeper and more probing questions. Usually start with why or how. You're really trying to generate a conversation, and so avoid using closing questions that require just a simple yes or no answer. Step 3 would be group discussion. So talk to one another about what has been unpacked. The person that you're speaking to is not to be interrupted at any time. Again, going back to that truly listening, that's simply what you want to do in a group discussion, is to listen to each other and just to understand what each other has unpacked. And then finally, reflect. Reflect on the process that you've gone through, what you may, a great way to demonstrate that you've been listening, to prepare or share back what you may or may not learn. And that piece where you may not have learned is key. So what you don't know, there's important pieces. You be transparent and open about what you don't know, what you're interested in learning further. Is in generating conversation and building trust with a partner. And share ideas about so as you're preparing, understand what are the key issues that they want to address. So as you're crafting that invite, and recall, I said keep your agenda open in case others want to add to it. That notion of a common and shared agenda. Make sure their issues are getting addressed, not only in the agenda but as the conversation unfolds. Consider who would benefit by addressing these issues. So ultimately, and what do you know about those being impacted, and don't make assumptions there. So really that's about, so you and your partner at the table, but you're likely there, unless you're there meeting with someone with lived experience, which is key to this as well, but ultimately remember that you're trying to impact a different audience, and so it's important to have that discussion about making sure you're on the same page about who it is you're trying to move the needle with. Have a discussion and dialogue about how can you do the work better and what do you need to make this real. These are some steps to progress the conversation further along, and it's certainly not something you want to do right at the gate when you're setting your dialogue, but if you're further along in your communication experience, and if you've established and built some trust, these are certainly some tips to frame an ongoing conversation. And then remember, when you're gauging interest, that partnerships come in all shapes and sizes. So a core participant is someone who's interested in being actively involved in the functioning and development of the idea and the initiative itself. Someone who's involved wants to be frequently consulted or given opportunities to provide in-depth feedback, but maybe they're not rolling their sleeves up all the time and getting involved. You've got supportive partnerships, someone who wants to provide some sort of support or input, maybe attending something in the future or doing something that has a softer touch point like answering surveys or doing something online. And then you have interested partners. So they want to be kept informed of progress of the initiative, but are not directly involved in the work. And so likely that's your larger pot of your partners. And that's okay. And so being transparent and open about the opportunities for partnership and the different levels as you're discussing, that's important too. Putting someone into, or pressuring someone into a certain type of commitment and partnership is certainly the first way to seek some pushback. The other aspect of this to consider, and you may see this even in yourself, is that there may be times when people are have sort of what I call a partnership journey. Sometimes they're willing to be involved, but other times they're just interested. And so being aware of the different levels of interest and being open about them can be really helpful. And then keep the conversation going. So as I mentioned, when you're taking your RSVPs and putting out your invite to say thank you, always follow up with a genuine thank you afterwards. And this could be an email, a phone call, a bouquet of flowers. I mean, it's really representative of, it really should be representative of the dialogue that has occurred. Create some formal and informal measures for keeping people informed. So that piece about continuous communication and collective impact and it being so key to building momentum, make sure that your thank you, or that even worse, the end of your dialogue, is not the last time they hear from you. So consider how it is that you're going to keep in touch going forward. remember that communication is open and reflects a diversity of styles, and that's great. So that's something you may want to speak about when you set the stage, is how do you want to communicate going forward? And then as the conversation unfolds and as trust builds, allow for difficult issues to surface and to be discussed and to be addressed. That's one of the ways to really solidify a partnership and to entrench trust in that partnership, is to go through challenging times together, or to face difficulties together and to work through them. So allow for that space. Really the message there is to avoid avoidance, if you will. And as we start to close in, I want to ensure that we consider some challenges to setting the stage for dialogue. So we know that, I mean, no matter how prepared you are, no matter how much you follow guidelines about effective communication, and how much you set out to be open and trustworthy in your attempts at partnerships, you may face some challenges along the way, or even right out of the gate. There might be political tensions. You might see some imbalance of authority impacting your ability to have a successful dialogue. There may be some explicit or implicit differences between you and your partners. Perhaps you have personality types that don't mesh or that conflict. Perhaps you value different principles personally or at an organizational level, or that you have conflicting or competing agendas. I know this from experience, that competition is no stranger to a collective impact. We're often competing for time, money, and resources, and so that can definitely make setting the stage for an effective dialogue a challenge. And then, of course, we're all very busy. Appreciate you all taking the time to do this webinar, but we do know that when we're looking to embark on a partnership, that sometimes people are just too busy to respond. So there are a couple tips here to address some of the challenges to setting the stage. One of them being the role of the facilitator, and the other being, the other we'll get into as well, around a code of conduct. So first, the role of the facilitator. And you may have opportunities to research more about backbone infrastructure for collective impact initiatives, but a facilitator is a great role that can be played in a collective impact initiative. Without putting too much pressure, though, on the backbone infrastructure, this is one way that you can help to proactively address challenges to setting the stage. So having a neutral facilitator, so someone to conduct your dialogue, so to host really your conversation. This is someone who potentially comes from outside of the participating coalitions or organizations. And if the person or people are within your coalition or organization, at least ensure that it's mutually agreed upon that it's okay for that person not to be a third-party individual. The role of the facilitator also helps he or she helps to establish norms and satisfy the objective of your dialogue, ensuring that there's a reflective flow to the conversation, and just ensuring needs of all parties are considered, even if all needs aren't met, that they're at least considered. And they may do some or all of the following. They could send invitations and manage attendance. They could create and or own the structure of the meeting. They facilitate the discussion, either formally or informally, and I gave you some examples. The community conversations, serious play, those are all examples of more formal dialogue, but you could have an informal dialogue and just have a third party there to help ensure it moves along. It's always helpful to summarize a session afterwards, and to keep participants accountable. I would especially recommend using Facilitator with group dialogue sessions where multiple people are at the table. They help to create opportunities for everyone to speak, because even if there aren't competing priorities, having many people at the table can be difficult to hear everyone's voice. So that the role of the facilitator really is to help overcome some of those challenges that we talked about. competing voices, competing personalities. A facilitator acts sort of as the referee, and also someone to move the discussion along. A code of conduct. So what's interesting is in my early experience, especially in conducting community conversations, they were all very positive. Everyone respected each other's opinions and the dialogue flowed. But there are going to be times where conduct is somewhat unruly. So a code of conduct is about setting, creating or establishing rules that outline the norms and responsibilities and the proper practices for your collaboration. It's important because it provides an ethical backdrop to the ways in which you collaborate. And collectively, you should be able to come up with these practices and the norms and responsibilities as partners. It is hopefully a collective process. If you're setting the stage for an informal dialogue, so this is a one-to-one conversation, this may not be necessary, but if you're convening a larger group of multi-sectoral players, you can start to see how outlining meeting etiquette can be helpful. Some examples of what you can include in your code of conduct are things like strive to attend all meetings, send regrets in advance for necessary absences, prepare for meetings by doing your research. I mean, research has been a theme here. It demonstrates that you've taken the time to come to this dialogue and conversation prepared. Arrive on time and stay to the end. Back to this notion of listen is participating fully. Contribute positively, listen, and avoid side conversations. And that side conversations might not even be with someone on the room, it might be with someone on your phone. And fulfill any and all responsibilities assigned to you. And again, this goes back to the role of the facilitator, who may be helpful to prompt people to fulfill those responsibilities. Some best practices around code of conduct are to share the code of conduct in advance of your collaboration, to discuss it openly as a group, and make sure it's accessible for anyone new or joining your conversations. And then finally, to refer back to it periodically, so not just when there's a problem. So just to, when you're reviewing minutes or when you're reviewing the mission statements, or maybe doing, if someone new is joining your table, that's a great time to just take these rules and responsibilities back out and to review them as collective. So that's another way that you can help to balance the dialogue and to help ensure that it's as smooth and as respectful and as open and visible as possible. So that's it from my end in terms of setting the stage. Again, it's about building trust in all of the avenues of setting your stage, about doing your research, not just about your audience and what it is that you hope to accomplish by partnering with them, but also knowing yourself in the process and developing an accessible language before setting the stage, and then building a common language once the stage is set. And then being respectful in your communications and consistent, so that dialogue is open and that momentum is built and is maintained for your collective impact initiative. So with that said, maybe I'll turn the stage back to you, Amelia.
Yes, thank you so much, Rachel. It was a really powerful presentation, and I really enjoyed, and I think our audience can also appreciate all the different ways that you gave us very practical tools to be able to think through the steps for how we would do this kind of outreach, and to also anticipate the kinds of things that might come up. I think that the conversation around building a common language is particularly rich, and I think especially when partnering with an entity that could be at odds or unfamiliar with the topic, I think that's a great way to build some rapport. I know that we've had some questions come in. I'm actually having a little bit of technical difficulty. So Danae Hartfield on the USBC team is going to guide us through a few questions for you, Rachel. And then we'd like to open it up to have some group discussion on the questions that Rachel's framed up for us that are on the screen right now. So Danae, are you able to share some of the questions?
Sure. So the first question is, have you seen any useful models for engagement of individuals with lived experience in the collective impact work, such as a mom's panel, and is it a helpful technique?
Yes, so the most, what I'll say about in setting the stage for dialogue with people with lived experience is there's a few things. One, I find that while you want to make sure that you're going in prepared and doing your research, you also want to balance that with a level of informality. Sort of avoiding going in with too much organization, too much authority, too much structure is just a little bit too corporate, for the lack of a better word. So making sure that you're meeting in a place that's accessible. It's always about putting the person with lived experience needs first. So things to consider are accessibility. You're going back to that language for sure, making sure that you're using a language that's comfortable for both of you, and really making sure that that first conversation is very exploratory and not about making commitments on either side. So a conversation cafe is one of the best models that I've seen, where I've seen members of the community come in, members of the community with lived experience. Now, I go back to the notion of accessibility. You want to make sure people can get there, that there's minimal to no cost involved for them, and to consider, some things that we take for granted. Time of day. There's nothing worse than holding a conversation cafe in the middle of the day if parents don't, or at 3 when it's a very busy time in family. Very considerate of the person with lived experience needs. And so Conversation Cafe, to go back to that model, is, while it is structured in terms of a framework for having a discussion, it involves food, it involves coffee and tea and snacks and people around a table, and it involves just some open dialogue without any commitments being made. You can certainly ask about people's interest in commitments and going back to those levels, but you're certainly not sort of penciling in anyone or penning people in to make any commitments there. And one of the pieces of advice I would give, even in advance of doing sort of a more structured dialogue like a conversation cafe for people with lived experience, is to take some inventory with them first. And this could be something as simple as a survey, although you want to make sure that the survey is shared in an accessible way, to ask about what do they need to be compelled to participate in a dialogue, but also just physically to participate. Time of day, at this stage, you're doing it in an intentional way that's responsive to their needs. So taking some unassumed inventory, I've seen, can go a very long way.
Thank you. Another question is, what are some ways to evaluate the progress or impact of the conversation?
So if it's formal conversation, then certainly if you're walking away with a fulsome note is just one way of sort of the softening, right? The fulsome notes coming out of it, assessing people's in-person conversations, right? You can always tell by the demeanor of people. If people are walking away and not following up with you after to say thank you or to connect with you in some way, there might be some challenges in the way that the conversation was held. So there's something to be said about sort of the experience, the experiential elements of it, and being in tune with those. One of the ways that I would recommend is to include a survey as well, and going back or taking some sort of evaluation at the end. And this is where a facilitator can help, because people, I've done a lot of surveys in my day, especially when I was in the high-tech industry, and having a third party conduct the survey, or some way that the survey is done where the participant can be somewhat anonymous or at least private while they're providing feedback, can be helpful for your evaluations. So that's sort of longer, that's sort of for larger conversations. Depending on how, like, if it's just a peer-to-peer conversation, if that person's not responding, I mean, afterwards in your follow-up, that's certainly one way. But you could just ask, you know, this is all in the spirit of being open and transparent and building trustworthy, and so providing a safe place for people to provide feedback, whether it's formal or informal, will go a long way in just simply evaluating. So I would say just ask, and you can put more formal structures in place. So if it is a larger, you can say, you can ask questions just like rate your experience on a scale from 0 to 10, and to do some analysis that way. But certainly just asking and surveying in a way that makes sense to the volume of participants you've had.
Great, thank you. Another question: how do you ensure that communities are engaged while reiterating past conversations?
So, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure.
Sorry.
How do you ensure that communities are engaged while not falling into a trap of reiterating past conversations?
Right. So there's certainly something to be said there to go back to, you know, a lot of what I was talking about is planning, putting some planning into place. So I've seen this, right, because oftentimes the themes come up the same themes come up over and over in these conversations. And so one of the examples I was talking about was even that peer-to-peer example where there's different layers to the conversation. So just making sure that and so the layers again were around unpacking. So a lot of time, community conversations spend a lot of time on unpacking, and so give some time for that, and maybe come back to the unpacking element of a conversation regularly, but then be very prescribed and intentional about creating space for the other aspects of it. So asking clarifying questions. So sometimes it's about just making sure everybody's understanding things a little bit better, and then going deeper, setting aside separate time to then go deeper, asking some probing questions. And sometimes that comes with action items for people to come out, right? Like asking probing questions and bringing information back to the table. And then time for reflection. So I find if you structure the conversation in a way, like that's one example, to set time for unpacking, to set time for sort of asking questions, to set time to explore, and then to reflect. That's a very sort of minimalistic way of setting the stage, but certainly by being deliberate and intentional about the questions or the themes that you're using to frame the discussion, that can go a long way to making sure that it's not becoming redundant. And the only other piece, there's one way that I would circle back as well, is to summarize your learnings from a community conversation. So if you are being intentional about each conversation or each opportunity for dialogue, and this can be in person or online even, to go back to with a summative response as to what you've heard. And hopefully this will help new participants to the table maybe read through and understand what's already been discussed so that they can just sort of jump in. I mean, that's a bit idealistic, but certainly minutes can go a long way, or some sort of summative body of information that helps people understand what's already been discussed can even, there's a lot of creative ways in terms of how you can conduct that, but definitely identifying what's already been on the table so that you can move to the next stage of your dialogue and engagement.
Great. Are there any suggestions for building flexibility into the process?
That's a good one. Certainly flexibility is a little bit more difficult when it comes to in-person. I don't want to avoid in-person by any means. I certainly have some tech biases in me for online methods of communication, so you could definitely build in technology. So if people are not available to have in-person conversations, there's a number of ways you can conduct online conversations, and I believe that might be a session that you're going to do later on. A great example is an insight community or an online community where people can plug and play at their convenience. In terms of flexibility for in-person, I mean, I'm thinking just along the lines of attendance and going back to the discussion we just had about lived experience. So asking people when they're available and giving multiple times for people to show up. That's just one way. But also, I did go through briefly the ways that people could partner, so the different levels from interest to core. Putting that out to the table right in your invite can be helpful if you are looking to provide some flexibility. So if your ask is, hi, I would like to connect with you on topic X. We're convening a meeting on such and such date. Would love for you to attend, but if you cannot attend or are not interested, could you provide some input via email? Or would you be willing to dial in by phone? Or do you have some suggestions on who else I can bring to the table, if not you? So definitely offering alternatives in the way that they can participate simply by collaborating, rolling up their sleeves, or just certainly being there for some sort of consultation on the side. Giving people options is a good way to build in some flexibility.
Wonderful, Rachel. Thank you. This is Amelia, and we would like to open up the phone lines and give you all an opportunity to do some sharing. In addition to asking, any other questions that you may have, we would really like to know if this concept that Rachel brought to us today about evolving language across the course of a collaborative effort, where in the beginning you are speaking as familiars, perhaps at a small table of people that have a long working relationship together, or who, many assumptions are made when you're speaking to someone that you work with regularly. But as we go about the process of opening the table and doing more outreach, then we have to be much more thoughtful about how we speak and really starting with how we listen. So I was just reminded we can't open the phone lines, but please use the question box to chat in any responses or sharing about your experience with evolving your language and making your work more accessible to the public. And again, if you have any additional questions for Rachel, you could raise those at this time as well. And then Danae will ask anything that's popping up or share out from that box.
We don't have anything quite yet, so.
Okay, are there any other questions from earlier?
Just one more, and it is, do you have any tips for engaging communities in geographically large states?
For in-person conversations, certainly that's harder to do in person, but there are definitely techniques that you can use if it is an in-person conversation that you're trying to conduct. So one of the ways that you could do it is going back to this idea of a conversation cafe. You can hold multiple ones of those in various locations. They're not very costly. Well, this is relatively speaking, but they're not too costly to put together. You need a shared space and can do so in multiple locations that people can access, especially if they're in a commutable space. They're certainly more difficult to conduct regularly, so you'll need to take in timeliness as a factor. It's definitely easier to conduct a conversation over coffee if you're close by. So something like town halls is another technique that you can use to support a discussion. And one of the things with something like a town hall is seeking input in advance so that when you're coming to the table, there's some preliminary work that's done. And then there are some creative ways that you can do this, both in physical spaces, but also online. So I mean, I don't want to trump this all and say that that the best way to address geography is just by using technology, because there's a lot of value to bringing people together in a room, and there may be an accessibility issue with technology, but that is certainly one of the ways. There's also some others. Finding spaces that are already in use for other ways. So I'm even going back to the community conversations book I mentioned earlier. There's some great ideas in there around using food and movies to generate conversations. So, and really part of that is just about what that brings in terms of creativity and experience. But it also means that there's some shared spaces where people are already convening around these things. So I know, so I mean, I mentioned before I have 2 daughters, and when I was on maternity leave, children movie sessions were common, where mothers were already meeting in this space, and so I've seen where people have used those spaces where people are already convening to then latch on and have a conversation or dialogue before or after. So that's just sort of one very particular example. So using places where people are already coming, your desired audience is already coming together. And so that can help make the geographic space feel a little bit smaller, because you're not forcing people to go somewhere where they're not usually going. You're going where they already are. And so that's a tip for online use as well, but that's one example. So that's sort of my tip there if you're not going, if you're not doing something with technology, is to make sure that you're convening places where they already are. And then the other is what I mentioned before, is about consider breaking the geography down in chunks where you're doing it regionally, and then synthesizing learnings from that afterwards or iteratively.
Wonderful. Oh, this is so helpful, Rachel. You've given us a lot of insights. So I'm going to ask Danae, do you want to take us to the closing slides, giving us all some information about ways to continue this conversation online?
Sure. So we hope that today's presentation will generate networking and sharing, and we invite you all to join the learning communities that are hosted on the USBC website. We have over 20 virtual communities that focus on breastfeeding-related topic areas, from the Surgeon General's call to action and beyond that. And these are open to any site user, so please make sure that you visit and join those of greatest interest to you. The Collective Impact Learning Community, within this space, you'll find an archive of past webinar sessions. We also have some blog entries from past presenters, forums for discussion, and a collection of articles that focus on collective impact. So be sure to visit that online community as well. And that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you all so much for all you do to improve the lives of women, children, and families. So goodbye for now, and we look forward to having you all for our next Collective Impact webinar session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.